Welcome back to another episode of the Monte and Wolf Show. Today, I think we will be focusing primarily on Fredit Brion, or OK Savings Bank Brion, I can say right now, and their matches versus KT, which were the most exciting of the week. Maybe we can talk about D plus Kia. You know, they went 4-0. You mentioned before we started, Wolf, that there were all matches were 2-0 this week. That's interesting. I don't think anything else really happened in the LCK. Can you think of anything that might have gone down?
I mean, T1 did kind of like fall into small pieces
Oh
across the floor.
yeah. Oh yeah. So I forgot. So yeah, that's Faker is
That
out.
kind of did occur. Otherwise, not a whole lot. It was weirdly the most straightforward tier listed LCK week of all time. I can't even think of another week that I've had that went 10-2-0s.
And they
And it
all
was like,
went as expected. DRX 2-0 over T1.
I mean, I think that should have been the expectation going into today's matches, right? Um, and like fundamentally, I thought maybe T1 would be strong enough. Like I was kind of on the edge. I was like, oh yeah, maybe T1 could beat them because they have better fundamentals overall. But what I didn't know was that when you take the Faker out of T1, it just collapses and falls to small pieces. Like it's like taking the head out of Voltron or something.
What are you talking about? That was Coach Bengi's last game as head coach of T1, was a glorious 0-2 defeat to DRX. And it wasn't like the last time they lost to DRX, which was in the World Finals. This one was different,
This one was very different. This one was very different. They got stomped as well. It was not close. The first game where Poby was playing Jace, I believe, he like pushed in really hard, and we are like, oh, look at him trade, look at him hit shock blast, and then he then over traded into the Azir, like stood inside of the Sand Soldiers, and then like he had to get bailed out by his teammates. It was a lot of resources were given to try to keep Poby alive in that one and keep him at a reasonable level, and that was like the excuse you could give for that first game of like, okay, well, they put a lot of resources into him, he really needs a lot of help, and it's going to make the team look a little bit lopsided. But then going to the second game and then the series against GenG, you just kind of realize that there's no decision-making really happening in this roster. And like, Keria had some crazy weird moments this week as well individually, like his play topside in the GenG series, which is still relatively unexplained. He's kind of like the main shot caller is what everyone is saying, and it seems to be the case based on comms we've heard during this time when Faker is out. Owner, I know I've gotten a lot of criticism in the past for saying he was the hands jungler versus Peanut being the brain jungler. I think I feel a little bit justified after watching some of what we're seeing here. Like, he's got the hands, but I don't know what's going on.
We're back to the StarCraft jokes, by the way. I've noticed where it was actually Faker playing StarCraft and playing 5 champions all at the same time. In the early days of League of Legends, guys, there were memes, like picture memes with Flash from StarCraft, and the concept was basically like, oh, this other guy is really, this other guy I'm playing is really good, implying that the other guy was also controlling 5 champions in League of Legends, like Flash would be able to, in theory.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is rather remarkable and unfortunate. So to catch those of you guys up, you probably heard, but there are multiple layers to this scandal that rocked T1 this week. So first off, Faker announces a sudden injury, which appears to be quite serious, and that he is taking at least a 2-week break from the LCK. Their last match of the first round robin is versus DRX. They, as Wolf said, lose very badly in that matchup. And that's somewhat, I mean, they obviously didn't expect Faker to be out. I doubt Poby was really practicing a lot with the main roster. As you noted in our show last week, you yourself said Poby is not ready for the LCK stage. He is very underwhelming, even compared to other junglers in challengers.
Mid laners, yeah.
Or mid laners, right? Yeah, mid laners and challengers.
Yeah, he obviously is not a very strong player in terms of challengers caliber, and T1 is the second worst team in challengers at the moment, like we talked about last week. And so much so, like, I really wasn't sure if they were even going to play him, because Carrier was playing a lot of mid and solo queue. This was
Yep.
reported by a lot of people, so there was a large assumption for a while actually that Carrier was going to be playing. We were able to get confirmation very early because we got the rosters submitted to us that that wasn't the case. But up until the rosters were revealed by T1, the community sentiment was, oh wow, Carrier is going to play mid, and they'll call it Bout, who's the support from the Challengers team, to play in his stead. And Bout's like he's pretty good. Like I think he actually has a high ceiling. Like he hasn't performed amazingly this last split or last split either, like spring and summer. But last year I thought he was pretty good, and I think he's a pretty good Alistair player, which is very relevant right now. But beyond all that though, they decided to call up Poby instead. There was also the consideration of like signing somebody, which I think we talked about briefly on the show, but it's like this doesn't make sense really. And T1 actually addressed this in a press conference where they were like, yeah, we actually really thought about it, but we just didn't have enough time. We didn't meet the deadline, so we called up Poby instead. And ultimately, like, Poby, he's not playing well. He's not playing very well. Like, he's not playing LCK mid caliber, I would say. But it doesn't feel to me like this is about him. I feel like a lot of the symptoms we were seeing in some of T1's shakier games, like, for example, that Nongshim loss, we were like, oh man, something's going on. Like Faker's not playing that well. That's explained now. But the rest of the team's coordination and some of the shot calling and some of the map movements that we saw were so crisp in spring that we saw in summer really diminished and felt like a little bit shaky. They're now like inflamed with Faker being gone. You could just see that this team has serious internal problems with their communication and their shot calling at the moment. And when Faker's gone, it just all falls to pieces. And it says a lot about how this team was run, and it answers a lot of the questions we had and speculations we had about, like, oh, is Faker really the coach? Yes. Is Faker really 100% the shot caller? Yes. Like, we know this now. Like, it's basically almost definitive proof.
Yeah, I think that the severity of his loss is going to be felt by the fact that not only did his team not expect him to be there, and the players are probably reacting kind of emotionally negatively to that, which is probably making the situation worse, right? I mean, I imagine there's kind of a feeling of hopelessness right now among them, given this situation, which might also be further deteriorating their performance. But also, I mean, what was crazy is that their head coach and three-time world champion jungler Bengi decided to leave the team for the second round robin, and they announced this like 5 hours before their match versus Gen.G and after the DRX loss. So it's been a pretty brutal 1-2 punch in terms of what's happened to this team. And I imagine that even further demoralizes you, right? And when we talk about Faker being the coach, you guys have to understand that this has been what we've been talking about since 2021, when the 10-player roster exploded. Danny got fired from the team. The fans begged them to hire these former professional players as coaches. But in the interim, until Bengi was announced as head coach, Faker basically was the head coach. Polt is not a game expert at League of Legends when he was running the team. I think he was probably very knowledgeable about pro player, how to work with pro players and managing their day-to-day and practice schedules, everything like that. But he wasn't the one who's going to have in-depth knowledge of the game of League of Legends to help out T1. And really, at the end of the day, there isn't anybody more qualified to offer in-depth knowledge of the game of League of Legends than Faker, because he's had one of the longest careers. He has played at the very highest level, even if that hasn't been true in more recent years. He knows a fuck ton. So it's hard for him to, I think, accept really any coach. And he is always going to have a voice in these affairs.
He does. And, when you looked at Polt's leadership, it was overall, like you said, more of a... So in Korea, when you're head coach, it can just be a title, right? It can be like, okay, well, I have the final say. I can tell the main real strategy coaches what to do and the draft coaches what to do. And sometimes the head coach will actually stand on stage and offer a little bit of insight, and will ultimately say, like, no, I don't want you guys to try that strategy today. For example, it's like, if you have a drafting coach and a head coach on stage, the drafting coach hears one of the players say, yo, actually, I think I can play, Quinn here. Like, so let's say before Quinn started getting popular again, like, say Doran's like, oh, yo, I think I can play Quinn here. And then the draft coach is like, well, I actually think it's really good, but Score will ultimately be able to say, like, let's not try that today. Like, this is not what we prepared. Even if like it's a good strategy and it comes up, like the head coach may ultimately be able to decide, like, no. I don't actually want, like, Polt might have been able to say, like, hey Faker, like, I like this idea, but I think we should stick to what we practice. You know, that's like
Right.
sometimes what a head coach means. Even if you're not really leading the strategy, you actually have final say. Like Hirai, for example, on KT Roster would have like ultimately final say in a draft, for example, even if the draft coach might have a small disagreement or they want to do something risky. But also it can be like more managerial, like you said, taking care of players, making sure that they're, you know, showing up to interviews on time and stuff like that, and dealing with like Riot, for example. So like when Riot wants to talk to one of the players or wants to interview one of the players, like they would go to Polt, and then he could go to the management staff. T1 have an insanely huge support staff, so I think in this case not the best example because they have like a person for every particular type of thing. They have a massive group of people that come into them every day and handle all sorts of issues you would have to deal with as the most famous team of all time, right? But anyway, going back to the point, like Bengi was head coach, but he was also doing a lot of strategy stuff with Faker, and it was very clear when he joined the team that role shifted from we have kind of interim coaches who are talking with Faker and doing what he decides to it seemed like Bengi had a real voice. But then because of this, he got trucked. He got trucked really hard. The fans are really upset. And so
Why were they upset, Wolf? I mean, it just to be clear, T1 has made back-to-back, like they've made every single LCK final for the last 2 years with this roster.
So I'm not even really fully, it doesn't really make sense to me, and I'm not really sure why Bengi was under a lot of pressure from the fans, but it seems because of this. And I'm not a party to the internal discussions that happened in T1 around this, so you know this is based on just what we've seen externally and what my thoughts are. But it seems that the pressure for these fans against Bengi and what T1's weak performance, quote unquote, was compared to Spring, meant that they decided they wanted to push Tom into that role. So Tom has actually been serving as like not head coach because that's not his official title, but he has been the one who comes on stage and actually ultimately has those final says and makes those decisions in draft for a few weeks now. So it has kind of been Tom all along. And I think there was this like misconception that when Bengi stepped down, he just suddenly like was like, poof, I'm out. Like, and like actually the whole team was going to fall apart because of him, because he was already kind of pushed back by the org right now. And I personally thought it was going to be temporary. I thought they were going to like put Bengi back. They'd see Tom come in. He'd do okay, but they'd be like, all right, ultimately we're going to put Bengi back in because he has more experience. He's worked with Faker for a long time, and felt to me like it was kind of almost like a PR move. Like we're going to put Tom up there for a little while they're angry, and then we'll get our results back, and then we'll put Bengi back in and it'll be okay. But then Bengi just left. He was like, I'm not dealing with any of this. Like maybe Bengi was tired of actually just T1 being puppet stringed by the fans, and he was like, I want to get out. I don't know, but it seems like based on everything I'm hearing as well from behind the scenes, this is not a Bengi decided to leave, but we actually definitely fired him. It does not seem like that was the case at all. It seems like he actually made the decision himself to leave, and there was no pressure from T1 to get him out or anything like that. He just wanted to leave and move on with his career. Doesn't want to be part of the org anymore. Amicably, but he walked away.
Right. And Tom does have a really extensive history of coaching. So I used to cast Tom back in the day when he was one of the junglers on SKT. He was really well known for playing Udyr, and that was about it. He didn't play that many games. And then ever since, like, I don't know, like 2015 or whatever, he has basically been coaching for most of that time in various, teams in China or in Korea, including with Gen.G for a while. So it's not that he doesn't have his own experience in this realm, but I do think that it is crazy that they are trying to make these coaching changes now, or that at least the fans have gotten to Bengi so much that he felt that he couldn't handle the pressure anymore, which, by the way, continues to be one of the primary problems for T1. Yeah. They have capitulated to these psycho fans. So they've done a few things. They have basically themselves created the K-pop cult of personality around their team, which I don't think is very healthy for either K-pop stars or for the players. And on top of that, when the fans have stepped over the line, they have done nothing besides try to placate them further. And at a certain point, the org needs to put their foot down, because if you are going to pander to this level of abuse from the fans when times are good, just imagine, like right now, when times start getting bad, think about what's going to happen then. And it's going to cause so much pressure onto your coaches and your players that you are going to just crumble. And that's the start of what we're seeing right now. And this is very much partially the Orc's fault.
What's so interesting to me about, like, it's very clear that without Faker, some specific like things flare up for basically each player. Like Zeus, confidence issues, right? We've seen this obviously in small doses for him in big internationals, but second Faker's gone, he seems to have confidence issues on the Rift. Just in regular season matches against like DRX, for example. And then the match against Doran as well, the matchup against Doran and the GenG match as well. I feel like there's some confidence issues you could see in that series that just kind of flare back up, right? And for Owner, it's just decision making and pathing, right? Like he knows how to path well, he knows what to do, but then when Faker's gone, like it feels like he also has some sort of second guessing of what he wants to do in the game and when he wants to engage and when he wants to gank, and so he is not able to make the same big early confident plays with obviously Faker because he's not there where Faker roams. We've seen this all the time. It's kind of play style of T1, dive bottom, get Guma ahead, or go top side, get Zeus ahead, right? And then have carry Guma just play weak side and scale up. He's not able to make that happen, at least so far, right? It's only been 4 games, but you know, his decision-making prowess is not really what he's known for. It's more of his mechanics, and then seems like he and Faker kind of clearly have a plan together. Oftentimes they go together. I mean, not to say that he doesn't gank on his own, but Faker often goes with him, right? And also can be the one sharing information about whether the mid laner is going to teleport down or follow him. So when Faker's not there and Poby's not sharing that information, he obviously looks weaker as a result. And I will say, like, going to the bottom lane, Keria just sometimes has consistency problems and sometimes like turns into barrel. It feels like when he's under a lot of pressure, like, and we'll just flash forward on Braum and try to engage, or we'll just make bizarre decisions. He's not like flashing and dying in lane, but he had some very uncharacteristically weak games. And then you go to Guma, I'm like, okay, well, actually, Guma, we skip him because he actually seems to be playing just the same. Like, he actually seems to be just fine. He doesn't have a team around him, so he looks weaker, but I don't really have much to say about how Guma's play has changed without Faker because he's still trying his best. He's not making any huge mistakes as far as I can tell in these 4 games that we've seen. So, Keria, weird decisions, Owner, lack of confidence, strong ganks aren't there. Zeus looks really underconfident. And then Poby obviously is just, he's a 9th place challenger's mid. So, you know, that's kind of where the story ends for him. And like we said before earlier in the show, there were a lot of problems and cracks showing before Faker decided to take this break. And I don't know if when he returns, because it might be that he returns after week 6 and then he comes in week 7, but maybe he needs more time and it takes an additional week. But I don't know if when he comes back, it just is fixed. I want to say I don't think so. I think that this team has a lot of problems they need to solve and not a lot of time to solve them.
I think, though, that a lot of these issues are confidence issues, like I said, too. And partially, you know, him coming back will at least give the team more confidence that they can play again. And they don't have to really do that much at the current time. Although after this last week of getting bodied 0-2 twice, they have slipped down to 5th in the standings because of the map differential. So they're now behind D+, Skia, and Hanwha Life. But they're still 2 whole matches above Guangdong Freaks. And if you look at their remaining, you know, they've got Nongshim next week, which might be beatable with some more practice with Poby in the roster. And then they have D+, who they will almost certainly lose to, right? But you know, it's just the start of the second round robin. So as long as they can take care of business versus the teams that are lower than them, they still have a very good shot. I mean, they have a good cushion to get top 6 in this league.
I think they're probably going to go to playoffs. I think that is definitely obtainable. Because like you said, you have half of the tough opponents left, but half of the weak opponents left because you're just going through the second round robin. Now, if they lose to Nongshim, for example, you know, that hurts, but I don't think that alone is going to be okay. You're not going to playoffs. We would have to see, you know, one of these other teams like DRX probably, or Bro, and Bro actually almost winning a lot, but then like still losing means that they're really not in contention. So it'd have to be like DRX having a crazy run and Guangdong Freaks kind of just like continue to be consistent while T1 also plummets if they don't make playoffs. I just don't think that's going to happen. But I could see a world where, for example, T1 go to playoffs and lose in the first round. Like, I would not be shocked if that actually occurs, and then they will have to then play in the Worlds qualifier to go to Worlds because they don't have enough points from the finals alone. If they end up dropping out early in playoffs, they might actually have to play in qualifiers. If they end up making a deep run in playoffs, even if it's like just going to losers finals in the that third, fourth match, then that might be enough to where they at least are going as the fourth seed. But like if they don't, I mean, they might actually have to play through qualifiers to see if they go to Worlds, and that might be like against Hanwha Life. So that's a scary thing if they can't turn this around. I'm not trying to like say T1's not going to Worlds, like you heard it here first, but I am saying like the doomsday clock is like moving closer and closer if things don't change.
It's now 1 minute to midnight on the doomsday clock for
Yeah.
T1. No, but also, I mean, there's this other extraneous factor that people aren't talking about either, which is, I know this is a favorite topic of ours, Wolf, but the bullshit Asian games are back, being full of shit yet again. We thought they were full of shit last year, or I did at least. I won't speak for you, Wolf. I thought they were full of shit last year. I'm not going to get you in trouble. When they randomly force teams to forfeit matches because of COVID, and then were canceled because due to COVID restrictions in China themselves, meaning that it was entirely pointless. And now here they are again, pushing back Worlds, and the specter that is looming is obviously that Faker needs to be able to at least play in some matches. I don't know how many matches he needs to play in order to get his military exemption.
Yeah, I think.
Like, does he have to play? Can he just play in one match against?
My understanding is, I think if he participates in one single game, that he's there. I've heard that just being on the roster is enough from some people, but I've never asked for direct confirmation. But that doesn't make sense. That's not how Olympic exemption works. For example, for soccer or football. That's why like at the end everybody like gets subbed in and stuff. Like they just like sub everybody in really quick so that they can like touch the field for a second after the game is over, so they can all get exempt. And generally speaking, like I would assume that you would have to play at least in one game, but that might not be the case for esports. I don't know what they have in mind for Asia games, but
he will probably have to play at least one game. I think that's a really safe assumption.
Yeah.
If not more. And obviously, that's going to be a huge priority, because him getting military exemption means that he could theoretically have a longer career. So there's a bunch of shit that is going to happen that is swirling around outside of this, that is going to affect the decision making around Faker and what happens to him next and how long a break he actually takes.
Yeah, right. And like the thing about Asia games to me is that I don't mind Asia games as a concept, but I think that the way that Asia games is being pushed is like it feels very forced in terms of like, oh, we're Olympics now. I'm like, well, I mean, yes, but like, have you watched those qualifiers? You know what I mean? It's like we're not actually in a position just yet where the Asia Games, I think, deserves the prestige that and the attention that has been given. That's just my personal opinion. I think that like we will eventually get there. But one thing that is clear is that the military exemption is the number one thing for these players, and that's for me the thing that matters, and that's why I care about it. Like from a personal standpoint, because we are going to have the best of China and the best of Korea on real rosters and real teams that actually practice together and actually train together playing at Worlds. So, you know, that's for me like going to be good enough in terms of what it means for country versus country, even though some of the Chinese teams have Korean players on them. I just don't care about that much personally. But ultimately, because these players do have like 2 years of their lives on the line, a year and a half, I guess, you know, somewhere in between there on the line, it's really important, right? And some of these players' careers could be made or broken by their performance at the Asia Games. So there's all that pressure on them for how they're performing now, and then what the pressure will be on Koma, who's coaching that team, to see like who he wants to play and how that's all going to shake down. Because right now, you know, you're probably like, well, Chovy's the main mid. It's not going to be Faker at the moment because he's injured and he's had some weaker performances. But that roster is also filled with, you know, other T1 players like Karya, for example. So who's not been having very great performances as of late individually either. So there's all this extra pressure of like, okay, what if we don't make playoffs? We're probably going to make playoffs, but like, what if we don't make playoffs? Or then what if we don't have enough championship points for Worlds? Or what about Asia Games? And like, what about my next year team? Like, what's my salary going to be? Like, where am I going? And like, I've never played with another team for so long. Like, some of these players like Owner and Zayas have never even experienced what professional League of Legends is like outside of this team with other players, what other players are like and what their personalities are and how they actually interact. And no other team has Faker. So guess what? You're struggling without Faker here. You go to another team, you go to China, he's not going to be there either.
Yeah, and I think what's clear is that now a lot of what we've seen in the past couple years with this roster and their style makes a lot of sense when we consider that if Faker was the main shot caller. For example, we talk about their like pick comp style. We talk about how good T1 is at reading weird enemy team composition win conditions and playing off of those. How good they are at setting vision traps and drawing people into a favorable engagement. And it turns out, looks like a lot of that, if not all of that, was just Faker's shot calling and forcing, like bending the team to his will. And I think it's really hard to swap out Faker because he wasn't playing a standard carry mid style, right?
Yeah.
He was propping up the side lanes. And so it's not like he's a plug and play mid laner. As good as Chovy is, you might be able to replace Chovy theoretically with a more standard mid laner and not see potentially that much of a team style drop off, if you guys are getting what I'm saying.
Yeah,
It's a little different with Chovy because he split pushes more, so maybe that's not the best example. But Faker was playing a very specific style. He was the one pioneering the Gragas mid in summer. He was the one roaming a lot on the map, and that hasn't been the way that most mids around the world have approached the game. Like some of them obviously have, some of them
And some of them have copied him basically, right? Like he actually made the meta. So
the Niskis or the Yagaos of the world, for example. But yes, it is a style of play that T1 has really leaned on, and I think that's what makes losing him so difficult, is that they sacrifice their entire identity without him on the roster.
they did, and he has made such strong strides to like figure out how to play around multiple different metas extremely well, and like you were saying, pioneering the Gragas mid, but also it had a big part in obviously the double marksman bottom lane meta that they did in spring, because he was also trying to just play prio mids and then roam down and set up dives down there. Like that was what he was doing. He was one of the first players to play Ahri, for example, and play the new Vi. Like that was Owner, right? And it was okay. Faker's Ahri, Owner's Vi, and we're gonna play Ahri Vi and set up dive comps. Like we're gonna be the first ones to do that pretty consistently when Ahri got reworked. So all of these things are happening. We don't even know what the meta is going to look like for Worlds, for example, or what the playoff meta is going to be, because we just don't know what the patch notes aren't out yet. We don't know if the new dog champion is going to be like a thing, or what's going to happen with all that. But at this point in time, T1 look headless. Quite literally, they have like lost their puppeteer, their head, the brain is gone, and you can't fix that. You just can't fix that. Even if they hired somebody like they were considering doing in the interim, some free agent mid, it's not going to solve it. Even if you like somehow gave like millions of dollars to D+ and got Poolbay, the best mid laner in challengers, you can't plug him into this team. They're going to have the same problems. Now, at least he won't draw as many resources as Poby does because he needs help, but it's not a replaceable player. Faker, he's not a replaceable player. He just isn't. And for this team who's so reliant on him, it's like because they've used him, relied on him for so long, it's double the impact, right? Because not only does he make a huge impact, but you become like potentially complacent. Not complacent. That's not the right word. You become reliant on him.
I mean, I think that also it's kind of outrageous that there wasn't any kind of redundancy in this team, because this wasn't an injury that appeared overnight for Faker. He must have been battling this for many years. I mean, these are nerve damage issues that occur in pro players in their wrists and arms. So something might have exacerbated it recently that caused it to flare up, but for the most part, they could have and should have known that this was going to be a persistent issue that might require Faker to take a break, in which case you have to have some level of backup. There was no backup plan.
Yeah. This is actually the shocking thing, because like when you think about all of our top teams, for example, like this could happen to KT. Like what happens if BDD's he's out? Like what happens? The team needs to find a new mid. They have to call up their mid Feisty from challengers, and he's not going to be able to play with this team as well. He's not even, half the player that BDD is, although I think Feisty is very good. He's a mid laner I actually say good things about, but it does raise questions about like LCK rosters and just League of Legends rosters in general. Because like in Overwatch, for example, you were required in Overwatch League to have these massive rosters so that if something happened, you had multiple different players who could fill in. And usually those second string players were a little bit more flexible. And oftentimes you did see role swaps when players were sick or something was going on. They would even experiment with using them in Overwatch. And I think Overwatch is a very different game than it's like MOBA-esque, but it's not really a MOBA. And it's much more fast paced and you're constantly team fighting. And it's not like a snowball-y game as much as League is, where if you have like a 5,000 gold deficit, you're basically doomed. Whereas in Overwatch, if you get the right ults, you can make a clutch play and come back. So it's a little bit different, but in League, because player salaries are so expensive right now, you just don't really, and especially if you're on a roster like T1, you look at those players, like you just don't really feel like you have space to put another player on there. You also have your challengers team, and you're like, oh, we'll be safe no matter what if something happens to one of our players. But I think this is one example of like, maybe not. Maybe actually if one of your players is out for 2 weeks or gets in some sort of unfortunate accident, like it happened to Duckdom, for example, it gets pretty grim very quickly.
Yeah, and I think that the downward spiral really is beginning for T1 because even in a best case scenario, Faker isn't going to be at 100% until he gets a chance to rest. And I said this past week on Summoning Insight, but what's outrageous is that Faker played every game that it was possible to play last year. He was in both domestic finals, he was in the MSI finals and the World Finals. He had to play and practice so much extra as a result of going to both international events, making the deepest runs possible at both international events, playing through the LCK playoffs. I mean, the strain is absolutely enormous. And so 2 weeks is likely not going to be enough time to actually fix this problem. Does it need surgery? Does it need months potentially of physical rehab and rest? These are not easy injuries to solve. And
Yeah.
Even if he comes back, it's hard to believe that he will be at 100% until he gets an offseason to rest.
Exactly. I think the offseason is really what he needs more than anything else. And because of Asia Games and Worlds, like, he doesn't really get that much of one for a long time. And by the time Worlds is over, which is, later this year, as you mentioned, which is a smaller break between this year and 2024, then he has to worry about all the roster changes and stuff like that. And did he get military exemption and what's going on with that? There's a lot of stress that he has to deal with besides just being Faker himself, which is a very stressful thing because he's the greatest of all time, the most popular pro gamer. You could argue. I think it's pretty hard to argue against that of all time as well. And so I on the other hand, though, I think like I was talking about a little bit last week, we were speculating about how serious the injury is. They made a statement already that like the doctor basically said it's fine, but he needs time to rest. Unless that's just kind of some PR talk, maybe he actually is just in pain, but there's no real issue right now or some real damage that requires surgery. He's getting treatment for it, which there's all sorts of like laser therapy and stuff you can get in Korea for this. And he's probably just not doing anything strenuous, probably just not touching the keyboard. He did come to the GenG match and actually watched in person. There were like, I saw people tweeting about that. There were like rumors about that. That's in fact true. Like he was there. I saw him. He came backstage. So he's just resting. And I think that my theory is because he's played so long and because he has not only had years like he did this last year where he played literally every possible game, but he's done that multiple times across his career. He's gone to multiple finals, international finals, while also going to LCK finals, while also playing every season, while also playing like 3 seasons a year, for example, back in the old OGN format. So I think he's taken really good care of himself. I think he's really been doing a really good job, whether it's just him or maybe he's got a physical therapist and maybe T1's helping him out. I think he's really taking good care of his wrist more than StarCraft players have, for example, have had similar issues.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think that he will bounce back. But my bigger issue for T1 is not like, when he comes back, is he going to get hurt again? My bigger issue is when he comes back, does this team function? Because it was already kind of like starting to go down a little bit. And now that all the extra added pressure of this week of 0-4, next week, who knows, could be the same. comes through, like, can he come back and rally this team back to the form that they need to be to potentially make a run to the finals, which I think right now is pretty unrealistic considering how good Gen.G and KT are. And then will they be able to right themselves for Asia Games and Worlds qualifiers? Those are the looming issues I see where, Faker's absence definitely is felt 100%. But even before he was gone, red flags were there. So,
and arguably, I
I'm
think,
hopeful, but
T1 was, as you say, on a downward trajectory before Faker got injured and before Bengi left and before, the soul crushing absence of those two by the rest of the team had set in. Meanwhile, Hanwha, sure, they had this scandal with Clid, but Grizzly has honestly looked pretty good. And as a long-term switch from Clid was the worst performing member of that roster. And with him out, I would speculate that Hanwha is probably going to get better as the longer we go into this split. Viper still looks amazing. And I mean, D+ is a little sketchy, but when Canyon's on and Canyon has those carry games, they are a monster team.
yeah, there's only room for four teams to go to Worlds, right? And I think at this point, it's very safe to say that Gen.G is 100% going, and KT is like 98% going. So now there's only 2 spots left, and there are 3 teams fighting for it. The teams you just mentioned, D+ and Hanwha, and then T1. So the form has to be better. And if you asked me 3 weeks ago, is T1 going to Worlds 100%? I would have said, yeah. Well, we don't know who the 4th seed's going to be. Now I can't. I just don't. I don't feel confident to say that because it looked like, oh yeah, T1's not as dominant as they were in spring, but they're still our 3rd best team. Now there are serious questions, even when Faker's returns, like if that will stay the same. Because as you mentioned, Hanwha Life is leveling up. D+ looks stable right now. Tough to say until they get tougher opponents here in the second round robin, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly going to be tricky. And you look at that Gen.G game, and I think if you really want to cope, you might say, oh, well, yeah, T1, they looked okay in game 2 versus Gen.G. All I have to say is this. Gen.G is a known happy gaming team. And the only reason Chovy was dying in the mid lane at the start of that game when he 100% knew where owner was trolling. I mean, there's no real other excuse for what was going on in that game. And they did bounce back and end up crushing T1 in the end through, superior map play and macro. But the start of that game, Gen.G did not look like they were taking T1 particularly seriously. And
No.
were maybe pushing their limits a little bit.
I mean, that is a good point, like that we should address, yeah. Because I mean, happy gaming is the term we like to use for this, and Chovy's happy gaming quickly became sad gaming, but they turned it around. So I think T1 did figure out that Chovy was playing disrespectfully, and they were able to farm him for money. Most of that money going into owner, so it didn't end up being too impactful at the end of the day. But the weird thing about that game was, T1 is so famed for, especially in spring, Faker in a side lane, he gets collapsed on, or, you have Zeus in a side lane, he gets collapsed on, but the rest of T1 are through where the enemy team doesn't have vision, they're already coming up, and they set a trap to where someone looks like they've overextended the side lane, and then you end up winning this crazy 3v3 or sometimes 3v4 where too many resources are used on that solo laner who's ahead, and then he barely escapes, and then T1 kill everybody. And that was actually legit happening to T1 by Gen.G, where they'd have Doran, is Doran overextended? And then everybody's collapsing, and then what happens? But everybody from Gen.G pops out of the bushes like, surprise, it was a trap. And then
well, yeah, and it was quite the turnaround from the last time that these two teams faced, right? Like you're saying in terms of the style. But also, Doran kind of inted in lane the last time they played, and that was him dying on Gnar to malfight from Zeus in the first week of the season. Gen.G probably should have lost that series. But this time we got to answer the question of what happens if Doran doesn't run it down in the laning phase. And he looked really good. I mean, his team fighting was good. And it was a very, I think, by the end, a convincing win for Gen.G, which was very good, guys, by the way, because it was our match of the week last week for LFN. And as I stated, if Faker is out, these odds are crazy. And we did get, in fact, Gen.G at 1.5 before it was announced that Faker was out, before it was announced that Bengi left. And that's what we got. So thank you to Esports Bet. again for sponsoring that. Our match of the week, which we won't discuss on this show, is going to be Heretics versus BDS at the start of the LEC groups. But what that means when it's the match of the week is that you can get an additional 10% winnings up to $100 USDT, or its equivalent in another cryptocurrency or DJT if you're playing for free, if you've signed up using our referral link for LFN. On top of that, when you sign up, you get either a 50% deposit bonus up to $100 or a $100 risk-free first bet. And by the way, Wolf, I just looked. Nongshim are 3.15 odds against T1 right now. All I'm going to say, that might be good for a risk-free first bet.
Yeah.
Might take that one. I might take that one, guys.
That sounds like a pretty risk-free bet with high odds, and things could definitely go wrong for T1. They went wrong with the main roster in one of those games last time. They turned it around, but
exactly, yeah. With the main roster, they were kind of shockingly close to losing to Nongshim last time. So we're just gonna put that one. It's not our match of the week on LFN, but maybe you could get some value there. That's all I'm saying. All right.
And like the this week of LCK felt like it was defined by T1 and their absence, because everything else was straight up tier list in terms of what you'd expect to happen and then what happened. And the one match where maybe that wasn't the case was when T1 lost to DRX, because people were still kind of leaning towards, I think T1 still has the edge here just because they have the stronger team, and we didn't know the impact that it was going to have that Faker was not there. And DRX, I think they slightly overperformed in that series, but my point is that, like, that's why we're talking about this so much this week. I know there's some people who want to hear about, like, Live Sandbox's collapse and what's going on with that team, but I'd rather not just dunk on Live Sandbox for the hour we have to talk on this show. So we did have, like, just for those who like follow casually, we did have like Clear come into Live Sandbox this week. He looked okay, but they still looked pretty doomed in terms of their overall play as a unit. So I don't think that team is going to playoffs. Doesn't seem likely. We talk about Bro for just a second.
We should talk about Bro. It's our Brion check-in. We had a long talk about Brion last week, and we said, look, Bro, they're not the worst team in the league, but they're definitely going to be ranked as the worst team in the league after they have to play KT back-to-back this week. They went 0-4. But you know what? They are not the worst team in the LCK. They Lord Morgan almost got it done on Jax in some of these games versus KT.
He almost did. And
were those some mistakes from KT that caused that to happen?
Yes,
there were. But you know what? That doesn't matter.
But Bro, the thing is, Bro, if you only look at that one series against KT this week with the Jax game, the second Bro series, it's like, oh well, KT messed up, but Bro's not good. But it turns out that Bro has made teams mess up like a lot in the early game. Like they have taken fights on Herald where it looks like, oh no, bro, that's not it. Don't fight that. Like I don't think you can win this. It's super risky. And then they actually win these crazy skirmishes and they brute force their way through these early games. Sometimes they walk out of an early game because they have bad macro with like a 100 gold lead with 3 kills, and you're like, are they ahead? It's hard to know. But then sometimes like they end up with like a 4,000 gold lead at 15, 20 minutes, and you're like, well, this is unlosable. Like they've done it. Like they keep winning these fights. They've got a 2 Drake advantage. They've got the turrets down, but then they just do nothing with their advantages and lose. And it's actually just really starting to piss me off, Monty, because like you can really see the potential is there. And every time you cast a Bro game, you get baited. You get baited. You're like, oh man, this is the time. No,
I like it. Well, I like it, Wolf, because I play this game, which is how does Bro throw this game? Because I know the results, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, like in game 2 versus KT, who's gonna throw this time? And it's oftentimes it is just a lot of them randomly. Everybody takes a turn getting caught out on the map. Sometimes like half the team will take hex gates and just leave Henna there. Henna won't take a hex gate, then he just dies and they give up objectives. It's fucking hilarious. Yeah. Sometimes they get dragon advantages and then it's a Chemtech soul and then they just get fucked.
It's like often Umpty is just overextending, trying to clear for vision or something. He gets caught.
Umpty is the biggest he is the biggest criminal against positioning on that team in the late game. He gets caught a lot in the late game. But also, the thing about Umpty is you have to take the bad with the good, because he actually has the highest first blood percentage of any jungler in the league, and it's not even close. He's at 63%. Peanut's at 48%. Okay, so there's a huge gap in terms of first blood percentage. But
it's bro early game.
For all the work he does in the early game, he immediately can just lose you the game by getting caught out, and then the enemy team barons and kills you.
So I looked at, this is before, this was during the first KT series. I haven't checked since the second series, but I don't know if they actually had gold leads in, like, I think they might have had it in the second game. But anyway, at 15 minutes, their gold different, like their win rate with a gold lead at 15 was like 55%. So like that is absurd. So like when you are winning, you lose still half of the time. Is like kind of a crazy stat in League of Legends, because League of Legends does tend to snowball, leads do tend to further, and like for example, so I was like, well, this is crazy, and I was looking at these stats with Ox, and Ox and I were like, all right, let's look at every team's stats to see if like this is crazy or not, because we first were like, this is insane.
It's probably
like this is so bad
for most teams. 70%
Live Sandbox, for example, who is at a similar place in the standings, who is also, I think, by far way worse than Bro, although the standings would indicate they're the same. They are like 87% win rate with a gold lead at 15 minutes. So like, it's just like, I mean, even Live Sandbox gets it done when they have those leads. They very rarely do, but when they do, they win the game usually. Bro, on the other hand, they're just not doing it.
I love it, man. I unironically love watching this team, because the level of false hope is just off the charts. But it's even funnier when I just know the results, because I'm not watching the games live. So I just know that they are doomed, and it's already been done. Their doom has been delivered. I just get to see how it gets played out and who fucks up this time. And it is very funny for me. It is extremely funny.
Oh, on the positive side, another team I guess we should talk about, because we've talked about pretty much everybody else that's at the top of the standings. We haven't talked about KT that much. They did play against Bro twice this week, but what's interesting about KT is they now have had their longest win streak ever as an organization, and I don't know exactly how many games it is, but like they have never had this much of a win streak before. I think it's now 9 series in a row. I think they're 9-1, or no, it must be 8. Either way, I don't have the stands in front of me.
It's 8 because they lost their second match to Gen.G, so they would have been 1-1, and now they're 9-1, so they've gone 8-0.
So not only have they gone 8-0, they have not dropped a single game since they lost that series to Gen.G as well. They have won every series 2-0. So, respect where it's due. Like, this team is extremely consistent right now. Extremely consistent. We didn't even see when T1.
They also really haven't been close to losing any of these games.
Yeah, exactly. Like when
I'm thinking back to the telecom war, and I'm thinking back to their match against D+, and they were. It wasn't like they caught a throw. They were pretty much just winning all of these games straight up.
Yeah, and when you look at T1's run, where they had their perfect regular season and all of that, like, they didn't look this impervious. Now, there's still a lot of season left to play, and KT might end up losing to GenG, or they might end up losing a game or two to some of these other teams. But I think the difference between how robust T1 was in spring and this impervious record so far here for KT is that in the eye test, you could tell that T1 were pushing the envelope really hard. They were making the meta, for example. Everyone was copying them. For KT, it's just like, this team has damn good fundamentals. Everybody's playing extremely well, but I don't think it's the same level of dominance that we saw from T1. And obviously, GenG is still ahead of them in the standings. But I mean, we're on that collision course for Week 7 with GenG and KT when they face off against each other. Right now, I'm leaning very heavily towards, I think KT will be the victors of that series. I actually think they're the better team, albeit slightly. But it's really cool that not only this time we have 2 teams that are really strong, but they're strong in a different way than what we saw from T1, who had a very different play style and were very focused on the bottom lane and setting up those dives, whereas KT are winning in every lane. Like, BDD, someone's just dunking on people straight up 1v1. They're playing through Keen a lot, and people are like, well, they never play through aiming. That's just factually not true. They play through aiming all the time and actually get him massively ahead early, and then he pops off and carries. They'll play through any lane. That's the cool part about this team.
And I am promising you this time that I am looking at LCK summer statistics instead of spring. But as of right now, aiming actually has the highest gold differential at 10 minutes of any AD carry in the league. So, if you had complaints about Aiming getting ahead, he is winning. Keen is head and shoulders the best top laner in this league right now, and it's not even close. He should be the MVP of this season if he continues in this form. I don't really think there's a compelling argument for anybody else to be MVP. Even if Gen.G wins the league, I would still argue that Keen is MVP.
Yeah, I think the only other person that comes close is Pays probably.
Yep.
And like,
Yep.
For me, like, there's still half a season left to play, but I'm leaning towards Keen myself as well at this moment in time. And it's a conversation we'll definitely be having later on this show as well when we get closer to the end of the season. But KT is dominant as fuck right now. Like, his team is so good.
What I really liked about seeing both of the Breon series with KT this week is, I said last week, I like seeing these sometimes because you get to see them do one series, take a day off on the same patch, and then readdress. And so one of the drums I've been banging is what happens if Cuz gets ban targeted, right? Because he's been very successful, but he's been very successful in a very limited number of junglers, right? And we've been kind of waiting for Cuz to turn back into a pumpkin, and it didn't happen. In the first series, they targeted BDD very heavily. We saw him kind of default to Vhagar after they took away. They were like first picking Azir on blue side, Breon. Then they were taking Talia out of the pool. They were taking Twisted Fate out of the pool via bans. And so he pops up on this Vhagar. Awesome Vhagar performance, super good cage placement, just like really, really good Vhagar zone control and play. And so you see, it was not only that, but the rest of the team was playing around chokes with Vhagar properly. So you could tell that they have a lot of practice as a team playing around Vhagar win conditions, which was really nice to see. Fast forward to a couple days later, we get the second match of this series, and that's when we get to see the Cuz bans coming in. And this was the one I was interested in because I was like, what does happen if you ban out Vi, Viego, you take away Sejuani, and then you ban Volibear? What happens? Apparently, the answer is Nocturne and Skarner, which was also funny because obviously Umti was playing Skarner last week, and Cuz had one death in this series and continued to play well. And also, again, KT has a very good knowledge of team fighting and win conditions with their champions. They were doing things like, BDD on the Nico diving turrets and then chaining the Pop Blossom into a Paranoia. And it was just really, really, really good execution. Really good execution.
Like, using Mega Blast cones to fly over the wall. He did fail one time, but like you could tell the intent was there and the execution was like pretty crisp when he actually did it the second time and it actually worked. And he and his team are starting to push boundaries of like what they can do as a squad, because I think at first it was like focus on fundamentals, let's be a good team in team fights, and that's it. And then they were like, all right, let's try to figure out how we want to play around Keen. Let's try to figure out how we want to play around aiming. And you could see that progression through spring. Now in summer, they're just unchained. And like I feel like we haven't hyped KT as much as we hyped T1 last season because T1 had real opposition. But it feels like this season a lot of the LCK has collapsed, and the only real challenger for KT is Gen.G. So when they're just like steamrolling 2-0ing 8 times in a row, 16 games in a row through the LCK, we're not spending that much time talking about it because it's like another win for KT, business as usual. But I think we will get to some really in-depth discussions about how they play and what their weaknesses are once we get towards that Gen.G series and then playoffs, because I don't think they're a perfect team by any means. But man, like, we have to acknowledge the run that they're on right now.
Right. And I think what was important for me was not that they were just going to win as we got down to kind of the bottom of the potential barrel of certain players' champion pools, right? Because I think Breon, actually, the coaching staff, approached both of these series very well, which is to say, like, okay, well, we know KT prioritizes playing these roaming mid laners, and Azir. So let's take those away and see what happens. I mean, he did get Azir in game 1, but you get my point.
Yeah.
And the answer is, okay, well, they're still very good about they're going to play Vhagar. But the thing is, it's not just can BDD play Vhagar. It's does the rest of the team execute properly around BDD playing Vhagar? And the answer was absolutely yes. And when we get to the second series, I mean, the second game of this series had 4 jungle bans: Poppy, Volibear, Vi, Viego, and they early picked Sejuani to take it away. So basically, they had 5 jungle denials from Cuz. And the answer was to go to the Skarner. And they played well around Skarner win conditions, because it's not just the individual players play. It's about executing as a team around that champion's kit and win conditions. And KT persisted even as we're very deep into meta champion pools right now. So even if it's a weaker opponent, the burden of execution and how clean the team looks, that can still be judged. And KT still looked clean. That's the thing.
And I think that they clearly have backup plans, for these types of situations. And the champion pools are just insanely wide. So, like, Keen's champion pool is massive. We've talked about this all year long. Like when he was playing Urgot last season, for example. Then you have BDD, who, because he has played so long and has played on so many strong and successful teams, I think he's really gotten influence from other mid laners. He's gotten influence from other teams. So, for example, his Talia is insanely crazy, and he can pull that one out. His Veigar comes out, right? His Azir is insanely strong. His Syndra, if that becomes relevant again, if he needs to actually put pressure on the mid lane with the Syndra. So, you look at that, you look at aiming, and like, it's a great meta for him because Kai'Sa is strong. It's one of his best picks, but he's got a wide champion pool as well. It's just really hard to tackle KT in terms of draft because they don't have any glaring weaknesses. Similarly to T1 in the past, where you couldn't really just put your finger on their one strong point and eliminate them.
Yeah. And also, we know the rest of the BDD pocket picks are still there, like the Syndra, like the Zoe, right? These are not
Zoe,
picks.
yeah.
I mean, the Zoe, it's not a meta pick, but I mean, neither was Twisted Fate last split, right? Neither is Twisted Fate now, really. It is more meta than Zoe is, but the reason it's kind of more meta is because of BDD himself. So if they have to ever select any of these champions, you know that there are some pocket picks that are going to make this team really strong. But they don't get cocky, and I think what I like about KT is that, if you try and pinch their champion pools, sure, it's going to start to get a little weird, right? But the rest of the team just takes the power picks at that point in time. It's like, Keen's like, fuck it, I'm just going to play Renekton. BDD, I'll just play Azir and let's just play Nico, right? They're not trying to be fancy. They're taking the power picks where they can. And of course now with the Kai'Sa coming up as well, Aiming's had some very, very good Kai'Sa games.
Yeah. He's looked better on Aphelios too. Like, I think he's kind of stabilized a little bit as a player, and he's even had good Draven performances. So I think Aiming's pretty well rounded at the moment. Aiming gets a lot of flack, but I think he's very good. And I think right now he's probably, like, for me, like, at least top 4, top 3, like, in the LCK in terms of performances on AD carry. You have Viper up there and Pays, right? And then Guma is definitely in the conversation, so maybe Aiming is 4th at the moment, but 4th is good enough if the rest of your team is actually just insanely good at everything all the time, and they're always setting you up. Because individually, is he better than Viper? No. But, like, is he set up more often than Viper to do great things? Yes. So, that's kind of like the chicken and the egg conversation for what AD carry numbers look like sometimes. Which is why Viper is such a statistical anomaly, because, like, even without help, it seems like he puts up crazy numbers every time we go to late game. But at this point in time, like, I know it's 2 weeks, or we're about a week early. It's 2 weeks away. But I'm feeling very confident that KT will be able to beat GenG this time around. We'll see what happens next week. That may change our minds here. But I'm looking forward to seeing how deep this win rate or this win streak goes for KT Rolster, because, like, the org may never be able to replicate this because it's just so insane.
Yeah, it's great. Are you guys going to be on patch 13.13 next week? Can you say?
We are, I believe.
Okay.
And 13.13 hits next week.
Yeah,
see if that changes things significantly or not.
Yeah, I mean, it should shift up the meta a little bit. But we have to see which patches are actually going to end up being implemented for playoffs, right? At least it will probably do some things to the meta as it existed right now, especially because Annie will kind of drop in priority a little bit. Not a lot.
I think that Tristana is still going to be very powerful, even though Ivern is nerfed, because, like, for a while everyone was like, oh yeah, Tristana, Ivern, that's the thing you got to be worried about. But then people just stopped picking Ivern and kept picking Tristana. So the Ivern nerfs, I think, are not going to affect Tristana that much. And then you have, like, the the nerfs to Vi, which are
Yeah, I mean the biggest one is probably the
they're
nerf to
significant,
static
but
shiv itself,
yeah,
which is going to change, the way that some of these champions are going to be selected that have been very
LeBlanc
static
is
shiv dependent.
LeBlanc is not going to be as like prevalent, I don't think either. So we'll see what happens. Like I like to make predictions about what's going to happen with the meta on these patch notes, or I liked to, but then oftentimes players just don't even read them, and like we have like a whole week of the same exact meta before things get figured out. So I just I don't want to tell you guys I think this is going to happen because we really just don't know, frankly, until the players go onto the Rift and
Yeah,
start
and besides,
doing it.
the static shiv won't hurt Doran at all because he doesn't even know whether he has it or not. So
Remind me that this happened. These are the worst. These are the worst pauses that you can have. Like I hate when this happens.
I was laughing my ass off. I was because I was watching the VOD and I kind of skipped to the end of the pause just to see what happened. And you guys were talking about, oh yeah, so Doran said that static shift didn't go off, and you couldn't see the game at the time, right? And then the game comes back up, and you just look at his inventory, and it's not even there.
Yeah, yeah. That was these players, man. They've got to get it together. Please get it together, please.
It was
There's
very
a lot
funny.
of pressure on him. I get it, but like, I mean, this is like one of those moments where you realize Doran is thinking about like 7 different other things. He's like, okay, my wave
Yep.
state is actually a little bit bad. I need to come up here. Like, did he actually put a ward in that bush? He's like thinking about all these things, and he's like, wait a second, it's not chaining my auto attacks to different minions. And he's like, I have to pause. Like, the protocol is pause immediately.
Well,
Yeah.
any matches that you are excited? I mean, we've been hyping up KT versus Gen.G. That's not happening this next week.
No.
Unfortunately, D plus versus T1 might be a lot less exciting than we might have hoped for. Hanwha versus KT might actually be the best match of the week.
Yeah. I think it's either that one or weirdly enough, like Hanwha Bro sounds kind of cool. His Bro's early game is so good and Hanwha's late game is super good. So my expectation is that Bro will like get a significant lead and then get absolutely destroyed in the late game, but maybe that'll change. I mean, like Bro is not going to be a playoffs team, unfortunately. Sadly, I think they could be, but they're not going to be. So it feels like there's less impact in that series. But the other one that's interesting is KT DRX. I guess like that series is pretty interesting. Just looking at the schedule now, like it's at the end of the week. DRX have a tough schedule in Gen.G, but they did perform pretty well against T1 last week. So not so much against D plus, but at the end of the day, maybe
DRX
it's
has
interesting.
also probably gotten better. I think they've been performing a lot better since they made their roster changes.
Yeah.
So
I'm hopeful those series will, especially the KT series, will not just be a 4-0 week. Although it's really cool for the storyline for KT's run. I'd like to see them tested a little bit at some point before Gen.G, because that also might just mean that if they have 2 back-to-back 4-0 weeks after a week before, which was also 4-0, then how do you actually learn and improve? It's relying on scrims, as Gen.G are a really strong opponent, and that you might actually just kind of have a false sense of security against all these weaker teams, because there is a clear gap between Gen.G and KT and the rest of the teams. There was like a pretty clear gap between KT and T1. Now the gap is even bigger because T1 has dropped down quite significantly.
I mean, I think what would be exciting is if KT wins 2-1 over Gen.G and they both go undefeated. And because right now, Gen.G in terms of map score is 20-3 and KT is 19-3. So if KT wins T1 or 2-1, then they would be tied if they have the same map score, wins and losses going into that week. And so we could end up in a situation where like both teams are 17-1 with a tied map score. What is the
Yeah, it could be
tiebreaker in that
tiebreakers.
circumstance? Do they have to play a tiebreaker in that
They play a
circumstance?
tiebreaker. I think it's a best of one. I think
That'd be
it's
pretty
coin flip
fucking
for
hype.
side selection.
I think that'd
So
be pretty hype.
usually, I think it's last time we had potentially a tiebreaker like this, they scheduled it for like the last Sunday of regular
Right.
season. It would just be played after So like immediately after the games at the end of the regular season, tiebreaker happens in
Right.
ballpark.
And there is no English translation of the rule book, guys. I've looked it up. Like the only rule book is in Korean, so I can't.
The only rule
help
book
you
is
with
in
that.
Korean. Someone
Yeah.
should translate that, but there is no official English translation. And like because it is public, fans have translated certain parts of it at times. We've seen certain publications translate parts. It's never been fully translated into English.
Yeah, they don't want to translate it, Wolf, because then I will rules lawyer them forever, just like I do to them in every other single league that they're a part of. So I think it's actually just in their best PR interests not to do that and give me access to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the tiebreaker situation would be really cool. I'm just looking forward to KT Gen.G finals, man. We're gonna get it potentially 3 more times. So obviously the regular season, and then they could face off in the winners bracket potentially. Depends on how that all goes, and then in the finals again. So
Yeah, and then in the World's Finals later this year, because that's what the World's Finals will be, of course.
At this point in time, I will tell you guys, I'm not thinking that the LCK is going to be winning worlds. At this moment in time, at this current iteration of
No,
like this one timeline, I'm telling you guys that like
here's how it's
I
gonna
really
here's how
hope the
it's gonna
LCK
work.
wins, but
Here's
I'm
how,
a little
here's how
bit
it's gonna work.
concerned.
Well, Ruler is not going to have any time to practice with JDG heading into the Worlds patch because he's on the Asian Games roster for Korea, and he's going to be laser focused on avoiding that military service. JDG will come in, and there's always that one Chinese team with a lot of expectations that just inexplicably bombs out in groups. It's going to be JDG. This is the prophecy. KT and GenG goes to finals. KT wins the world championship. Keen MVP. Let's go.
Okay, but what about like Billy Gaming? What about that team?
No. JDG's the
What
only
about
threat.
that team that also beat the Korean team?
It's gonna be a fucking Zoe meta. BDD is gonna hard carry on the Zoe priority meta. Cuz is just gonna ascend to godhood. He's gonna pull a Zeka from last year. Cuz is the new Zeka. He's gonna be the patch Zerg of Worlds this year.
It could happen. Look, I'm all for it. Okay, but in the interest of like being fine print here, I do not expect this to happen.
Wolf's not subscribing to my fantasy. Come on, man. Come on.
Not yet. We'll see what happens. Like, there's still a lot of season left to play. Like I said, maybe KT continue to level up because it feels like they are getting better and better. But it may also be a bit of false data because of the lack of strength of the LCK just overall as a whole right now. It's very top heavy. It's 2 teams that are relevant, and then a bunch of other teams trying to be relevant.
And maybe Hanwha by the end. We'll see. At least they're
Hopefully.
it feels like they're going in the right direction. If the mid champion pool could just get like a little bit better for Zeka, then I think maybe they would have a shot.
Yeah. And I think Kwangdong playing them a little bit close at the end of the week was also Kwangdong playing pretty well overall too. Like, as much as people might want to criticize Hanwha for that series, because they played their own style too and still were able to take it in the end despite a massive deficit in that second game. So I'm looking at Hanwha to maybe be a cool storyline, because especially when you consider the Klid drama and situation that Grizzlies like really risen to the occasion is actually pretty hype. Like, it's a fun storyline, and I hope they continue to do well. I would not be shocked if they are one of our world seeds as well, if that continues.
What if Zeka and Kingen pull off the back-to-back world championships?
What if they suddenly become world championship players again, like they have not been for this entire
What if they just
year?
patch Zerg? What if they patch Zerg 2 years in a row?
What if it just becomes an Akali meta again?
Akali, Silas, and Ornn Gragas and Aatrox.
I could see an Akali Aatrox meta for sure. It could happen. Been a while.
All right. Well, there you go. There's enough LCK fantasies for you for tonight, guys. We'll be back to talk more about the perpetual downfall of T1. It seems like Faker's second off week at minimum. Hanwha Life and more joyous KT discussion next week. See you then, guys.